Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on general business conditions. I'm Haley Shenander of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Before I turn it over to our speaker today, I have a few housekeeping items. Slides for this presentation and a copy of the video link will be emailed to all registered attendees next week. Ron will be entertaining questions at the end of our presentation. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box on Zoom. We'd also love to get your feedback at the end of this presentation, so please take a moment to fill out the brief 3-question survey that pops up in your Zoom window when you exit the webinar. I also want to note that the views expressed during this presentation are the presenters and not those of the Minneapolis Fed or the Federal Reserve System. So before we get into the survey results, I'm going to provide a little background on this general business survey. The General Business Conditions Survey is one of the largest regular surveys of businesses conducted among the 12 regional reserve banks. This is only possible thanks to our partnerships with chambers, government agencies, and other business groups who send the survey to their contacts on our behalf. So as always, huge thank you to all of our partners who help make this possible. Now, the survey we're discussing today was conducted between July 16th and July 29th. We got 587 responses from business owners across the region. And we continue to see good balance by both firm size and sector, but it's important to note that these responses come from a convenient sample of businesses and may not be representative of the larger business population. Because of this, the results of the survey should be seen as more of a snapshot of current conditions and interpreted carefully. I do have some quick takeaways from the survey before we look closer into the data. Overall, there really hasn't been a lot of change recently. Both revenues and profits were more negative, and while large firms are still outperforming smaller firms with regard to revenue, that gap continued to narrow quite a bit. However, profits for larger firms are still much higher. Firms often pointed to inflation and high interest rates as their top challenges, which has been the case over the last year. Most states in the 9th District have been experiencing both slower GDP growth and employment growth in the US, which could also help explain the more negative report than may be expected here. On the brighter side, there is still demand for workers, even though it has continued to cool quite a bit since last year. And labor availability, while still a problem, has been improving somewhat, and wage pressures have also moderated more. Overall, the sentiment for outlook remained modestly positive. And with that, I'm going to let Ron take it away to talk about revenue and profits.
Thank you, Haley, and I appreciate everyone's attendance today. You know, on a summer day, I appreciate anyone's chance to listen to what we see in the economy. We had a lot of input from a lot of businesses, and we love sharing this information. Wish we had a little bit better news, but it is what it is. So let me first briefly talk about recent and future revenue, and let me give you a little bit of an idea, for especially for those that are new to this webinar, a little bit how we design a lot of these charts. So we're trying to ask a lot of questions from different time frames, so we get a little bit better idea, kind of triangulate different views. And what we do here is we ask recent revenue for quarter over quarter. That would be the top bar, and then the same this quarter compared to the same one last year, and then expectations for the future. And as you can see right here, and red means decline, green means increase or growth. And what you can see here pretty quickly, because there's not enough green on this screen, is that revenue trends remain pretty weak, especially year over year. That'd be the middle bar. If you look at the quarter over quarter, the top bar, I would say the results there look a little bit flat, maybe a little bit more positive. Unfortunately, the Q1 negative for GDP was negative in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So flat in this case, if we're talking about quarter over quarters, not necessarily a great signal either. Expectations for the current quarter, maybe a little bit more positive, but I would say actually just more of the same. In terms of profits, those have also been declining or weakening. You know, so what we're seeing really very persistently, again, because there's none of green on this screen, is that margins continue to really get squeezed across the board. And I think the sources are all pretty obvious to most people here. We're talking about higher than average inflation, even though it has come down significantly. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Interest rates are higher, so those depending on financing are that's eating into margins. And then again, you just have weak revenue growth overall lately. And lower, I do want to note that we don't ask whether or not firms are unprofitable. That's where firms are really going to be getting into trouble. And we don't really know how many are unprofitable. We just know that margins are getting squeezed. But clearly, this is not a good sign. We also like to look at revenue and different metrics kind of over time. How are things changing as we do this survey over time? And I would say here is, it seems to me that we've kind of hit a little bit of a plateau, a negative plateau in some respects. So if you look at the chart on the left, recent revenues compared to last year, so year over year for the last 4 surveys. Compared to last July, things have gotten a little bit more negative. Compared to January, things are roughly almost exactly the same. In terms of expectations for the current quarter compared to last year, again, compared to July of last year, a little bit more negative. Compared to January, it's actually a little bit more positive. But again, I would not call that a huge signal yet. We also ask firms to give us a little bit of a few a few demographic traits so we can kind of splice the data a little bit. So we asked them to identify the state they're in, and I would say here that responses by state really tend to be idiosyncratic because we don't get a lot of responses from every state. Who responds there is maybe less representative than the pool as a whole, but we do have partners in every state, so I always like to show at least one chart as broken down by state. And here what you see is just generally the big trend here is that every state did show that same negative revenue trend, some more than others, Minneapolis, St. Paul being a little bit more negative than others, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan being a little bit more positive than others. But again, I would interpret this particular set of data very, very cautiously. In terms of results by sector, again, because we asked them to sort themselves by sector, I believe there are 10 or 12 options. We don't get a lot of responses for any individual to really feel comfortable with a representative sample across all of them. But especially among those that got at least 25 responses, what I can say is that the finance, real estate, and insurance sector, along with nonprofits, those were the only 2 sectors that saw a positive year-over-year revenue trend. On the other side of it, construction, manufacturing, and retail trade, along with accommodation, those were the ones that reported the most decline in terms of year-over-year revenue. We also like to look at firm size. That has been an indicator pretty strongly during the pandemic. And here what you kind of see is that the most of the size advantage, if you've been part of this webinar in earlier years, there really was kind of an outsized advantage to large firms. And what we've seen in the most recent one is that's kind of really compressed a lot. So they're seeing a little bit of advantage by size, but not nearly. If you look at the chart in the bottom right, that's from January 2023. And here's where you can really see where larger firms were really having much more success in the economy. And what we're seeing is that there's some compression to those results by firm size. Profits as well. Here's something that's actually a little bit different. There is here you do see some advantage by firm size for the most recent quarter, with large firms definitely seeing better profit margins. If you go back a year ago, there was actually a lot of compression then. And I think what you're seeing in this particular chart is profits. Last year, July 2023, was the comparison year was 2022 when things were really strong. So I think there you're seeing a little bit of rotation in terms of some challenges for large firms and all firms, frankly, and some firms being able to then pivot, maybe right size, and then see profit margins maybe bounce back a little bit. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Haley, who is going to talk about workforce and wage trends.
Thanks, Ron. So yeah, let's talk about what we saw with workforce trends. Overall, there is some more negative news with regards to hiring demand here. Here on this chart, we're comparing the prior 2 years surveys in blue and green to this year's results in red. We see that compared to 2022 and 2023, a much higher share has stopped hiring and more firms are cutting staff, even though from very low levels. For those that are still hiring, which is over half of respondents, most are hiring to replace turnover or looking for temporary staff, and a much smaller share is hiring additional workers than they have in previous years. This is a pretty clear sign that firms are continuing to pull back on hiring. It's still mostly healthy given that majority are still hiring in some way, but there has definitely been some cooling here. We also see that many businesses expect their staffing to be flat in the near future, with an equal share expecting to increase their staff levels as the share that is expecting to decrease their staff. This marks a slight change since the last 2 July surveys, where hiring expectations were net positive overall. For the firms that are still hiring in some capacity, they are still having a hard time finding the right staff, but the level of difficulty has decreased over the last few surveys. Many firms now find it slightly to moderately difficult to find workers rather than extremely difficult. And to better understand why hiring has been difficult, we ask businesses about what their biggest challenge has been for hiring. We see that applicants without the right skills or experience has been the main challenge, and this has increased over the year. Issues with wage demands have also increased, but what's kind of interesting is that the problem of not having enough applicants has declined significantly. This indicates that there may be more people interested in working, but there's a skills mismatch with those who are hiring. And we heard a lot of similar things in the comments that business owners left as well. Now, looking more closely at wages, we see that wage growth is still strong, but somewhat stabilizing this year. Most businesses, when they offered additional commentary in the survey, mentioned that they felt pressure to increase wages to either retain their employees or attract new hires, even if it was becoming harder to afford those increases. Additionally, the largest firms reported raising their wages at higher rates than smaller firms, which you can see in this chart here. This is something we've seen pretty consistently throughout the years we've done this survey. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ron to talk about the other challenges businesses are facing.
Thanks, Haley. Yes, and I'm sure everyone who's watching today knows and has experienced a lot of these challenges. So we ask a question, what are the two biggest challenges to your operating capacity and productivity? And we didn't see a lot of change in terms of the answers to this. We still see that price increases for inputs, so inflation is still the highest ranked challenge. High interest rates are there. We all know what's happened with interest rates. They are the highest they've been in some time. And then labor availability, what you see there is kind of what Haley just got done talking about. It's improved, but it still is really a challenge. And we still hear an awful lot about labor availability challenges, especially for certain sectors. And then there are certain others. Not only are there three major challenges, but then firms are also seeing many other challenges as well, more on an anecdotal basis. In terms of prices and inflation, again, with that being the top challenge, we want to get a little bit better idea on how they are actually what they are actually seeing in prices, both at the wholesale level, and that's the chart on the left, as well as on the retail level, those prices to customers, that's the chart on the right. And the good news here is that we've been doing this survey now, well, longer than the chart actually shows, but over the last 4 years, roughly, 3.5 years, what you've seen is the increase that kind of flowed through through July of 2022, and then the real steady decline in both at the wholesale level and at the retail level. That's the good news. I think we've seen very persistent decline in price pressures. What I would say though is that I think everyone still feels that there is still a fair amount of inflation in the economy. From a data standpoint, we know that prices have come down and they continue to move more towards the Fed's 2% goal. Overall, they're not there yet, and businesses are telling us that they're not there yet, and they're still feeling some pressure there. In terms of interest rates, again, when interest rates are higher, that's obviously going to be more negative for more firms. And that's generally what we've been hearing. Again, we ask because we want to know exactly what the impact of higher rates are, just so the Fed is aware of the impact. I wouldn't call this good news, but we did see a small decline in the significant negative impact. I would call it marginal. But again, a little bit uptick in those that are seeing modestly negative impact. And then, those that are seeing no impact, those that are really not depending on a lot of financing, is pretty steady as well. There are a few firms that are seeing some positive effects. We've heard reports that, those that maybe were planning on an expansion that have held and have invested those things are seeing some net positive impacts from that, from the savings on that and from the investment growth. But again, those are on the margins. So let's talk a little bit about outlook. And here, again, I don't want to overstate the fact that this is positive, but I do want to note that this is still net positive. There still are more firms that are optimistic than are pessimistic. And that's actually grown just a little bit over the last 2 years. I think some of it is, just kind of natural optimism. I think if you're running a business and things aren't going well, I think you have to be hopeful that things are going to get better. So I think there's some some reality here that hopefully things are actually getting better, but there probably is also just the expectation that if things are getting worse, you're going to improve things in your business, maybe tighten your expenses or other things that will help your business compete better in the future. The other thing that I would note though also is that if you look at the bottom left chart, is that if the outlook by firm size um, is also, I think, sends a little bit more positive message. I think there is a lot of adjustment. Firms have been adjusting literally for the last 4 years in this really challenging environment. And I think they've been excellent at it. And so I think what we're seeing with regards to larger firms is their outlook is a little bit more positive, maybe because they've gone through some of the struggles with higher interest rates, price inflation, and that they're seeing a little bit more improvement, a little bit more optimism going forward. Again, sole proprietors, I don't want to dismiss those that are working for themselves. They are seeing a lot of pressure, again, because they don't have the scale. They may have less ability to change what they're doing. When we wish them obviously better luck than what their outlook is going forward. Some final thoughts. Again, as Haley mentioned right off the go, there isn't a lot of change from our previous surveys on this. Revenues and profits continue to be soft, and that's not good news. I think we have to acknowledge that. There are some positives. Labor is still positive, but it has slowed. That's, kind of half full, half empty. It is getting softer, but it is still net positive. So I think we have to remember that. Inflation's still a major concern, going the right direction, but again, still a major concern. And there are other things that are other pressures that are easing along with prices. So we are seeing that labor availability is getting better, and we're seeing that wage pressure overall is improving, even if it's maybe not back to pre-pandemic levels. Excuse me. Outlook is also modestly positive and more so among larger firms. And again, the reason it's notable that larger firms are a little bit more optimistic is they employ the large majority of people. And so while it's not great that smaller firms are seeing more pressure, the fact that larger firms is helpful in the sense that they are the ones that drive GDP. They're the ones that drive employment. So hopefully that's a good sign going forward. And overall, economic and employment growth has been slower, really throughout much of the pandemic recovery in the 9th District than the national average. That's true this year. And what this survey tells us is that it appears that slowness is continuing compared to the national average. So I'm going to hand it over to Haley to do a few last things before we get to a Q&A. Take it over, Haley.
Sounds good. So before we jump into the Q&A, I do want to share some information about the other surveys we conduct. In addition to the general business survey, we also survey businesses across a variety of sectors. We have a monthly business pulse survey to track business conditions on a more frequent basis coming up later this month, and a hospitality and tourism survey in the field right now. None of these surveys would be possible without the support of our survey partners. Our partners span the entire 9th District and come from organizations like chambers of commerce, economic development centers, state agencies, and more. These partners help distribute our surveys to their business contacts so we can get a greater understanding of current economic conditions. If you're from an organization that would like to become a partner on future surveys, or if you're a business owner who would like to take these surveys, please scan the QR code on your screen or click the link I just sent in the chat to sign up. So with that, we do have some time for questions. And as always, if you have a question, please type them in the chat box on Zoom. Let's see. Let's start with this one. With staffing mostly flat and the prevalence of remote work, have businesses said anything about changing their commercial real estate footprint?
As a matter of fact, we asked the question about that because the Fed is interested in knowing what's happening in commercial real estate space. So we asked the question just whether firms had any expectations of changing their footprint, given remote work trends and things of that nature. And honestly, what we found out was really not much. We didn't find out much of anything, and I mean that only in the sense that many are not changing much. Roughly the same small share of those that expected to decrease their footprint in terms of their office space or their operation space was equal to the share of firms that were increasing their footprint. But the very, very large majority were essentially standing pat with the space that they expected to rent. So we really, I guess in many ways where I think we were a little nervous that there was more pressure on commercial real estate in terms of firms lessening their footprint. We didn't find that. It was really like it's kind of this. It would be a situation that I would kind of expect almost in most circumstances that things are mostly the same.
Great. Someone else was wondering, we haven't seen wage growth decline to a level that reflects pre-pandemic conditions. Why might that be?
I'm sorry, say that again, Haley.
We haven't really seen wages decline to a level that reflects pre-pandemic conditions. Why
Oh,
might that
right.
be?
Well, that's a very good question. I think most of it is that despite the fact that we haven't had that we have had some labor availability improvements, they haven't been enough to really put a lot of people out of work. So there really still is a lot of labor pressure. So a lot of firms, especially in certain sectors, really still struggle to find workers. And even if it's not as bad as it used to be, it's still bad comparatively. So if I were to go back to pre-pandemic levels, I would say, the number of job openings is still slightly higher than it was back in roughly, 2018, 2019, only by little. But again, even that time, there was excuse me, wage pressure then, and we heard a lot about labor shortage. So the conditions have eased, but they are still quite tight, especially by kind of historical norms. And I think that's why employers really feel like they can't afford not to pay workers, because if they don't, there's still many opportunities out there, and those workers are still going to be footloose and fancy free in terms of looking for other opportunities. So we've heard that a fair amount, in that a lot of employers feel pressure to still at least give inflationary increases, just to make sure that they can keep their turnover at a reasonable rate.
Got it. Someone else was wondering, did you happen to see what sectors are seeing the most mismatch between required skills and applicants?
I didn't actually look at that particular question. I'm curious, Haley, if you by chance looked at anything in that area.
I wasn't looking for that specifically, but I did notice when going through comments that a lot of comments about the skills mismatch were coming from construction firms and other kind of hard labor skills like that, where they were not able to find the people for more of those advanced positions, but for the lower level positions, they were able to.
Right. And I would just only add to that, my anecdotal sense for that is very similar to that. Construction, we hear about it of an awful lot, and we've heard about it for 6, 8, 10 years, really, in terms of the skills and the younger workforce coming in, and the training and some of the journeyman programs and things like that, that we've seen skill mismatches there quite a bit. And I would agree that I think anytime we're looking at higher skill positions, that's probably where we hear the most about skill mismatches. Now, I would also say that I'm starting to hear a little bit more about skill mismatches also in lower level areas, customer service areas, maybe where the skill we're talking about is a softer skill, showing up on time, wanting to put in, a full day's work, etc. I don't know exactly how much to read into that, but we are hearing a little bit more, it seems like, from employers about those issues.
Got it. Someone else asked, did you see any impact from the rainy summer season on businesses?
We, I will have more to report on that in September. So the rain is going to affect more tourism and hospitality kinds of businesses over the summer. We are actually in the field right now, as Haley mentioned earlier. We have a tourism and hospitality survey out in the field for only in Minnesota, and we'll be reporting on those results in September, late September. The 27th. So I will be able to give you a much more official comment on that. What we hear anecdotally is I don't think the season comparatively, it kind of depends on what kind of time frame you're talking about, or at the individual level. Some firms clearly saw an impact where there was severe flooding over the summer in certain spots. What every summer though sees some extreme weather, and it's so right now it's a little bit hard for us to tease out whether or not this was a better summer or a worse summer, where and for whom. I would generally say there was impact. I don't know that it was enough to drive results more negative for our group as a whole than what it would have been.
Yeah. Someone else asked, is there concern about the availability of bank financing or access to credit lines?
We are not hearing about access. We're not hearing about problems. But that's also that's probably an issue that I would probably need to look into a little bit more as kind of an official Fed comment. We're not hearing about it a lot. Whether or not we see it on a more systematic basis, I'd have to do a little bit of investigating. If someone wants, whoever asked that question, if you want to drop that in your email in the chat, I'd be happy to follow up with you more specifically once I had a chance to take a look at it.
Great. And it looks like that's all the time we have for questions today. So I really, thank you everyone so much for joining us. More information will be in our follow-up email to this event that's going to go out later this week. And with that, I hope everyone has a really great day.